By spring 1944, southern England was converted into a massive military parking lot, holding the largest invasion force ever assembled. This map of Allied unit markers shows the congestion. 2 million men and 7,000 vessels were distributed across thousands of camps and ports, all waiting for a single order to move. An Allied failure in France would have allowed Hitler to strip his western defenses and redeploy his panzer divisions to the Eastern Front, potentially pinning the Soviet Union into a permanent stalemate. The British were already cannibalizing their own divisions for infantry replacements. They had no more men to spill on a second attempt. A defeat at the beaches likely would have collapsed Winston Churchill's government, leaving a negotiated peace as the only path forward. The survival of the Allied cause depended on launching this one-shot operation before German intelligence identified the location of the vulnerable armada. Success required two environmental conditions. Paratroopers needed a late-rising moon for visibility, while landing craft needed an early morning tide to clear coastal mines. These narrowed the launch window to just 4 days in June 1944, the 5th, 6th, 19th, and 20th. The target was June 5th. But at 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, a massive storm battered the English Channel, forcing Dwight D. Eisenhower to issue a 24-hour postponement. This delay pushed the operation to a breaking point. The longer the fleet sat in the ports, the higher the risk that the Germans would detect the movement and pivot their heavy armor to the Normandy coast. 17 hours later, the weather showed no signs of improvement. Severe wind and rain lashed against the windows of Eisenhower's headquarters at Southwick House, as his commanders debated their remaining options. Then, a critical update arrived from the meteorologists. They predicted a mild temporary break in the storm would open for June 5th and 6th. At 4:15 a.m. on June 5th, Eisenhower convened a final meeting. He polled his silent commanders, weighing the risk of the storm against the risk of further delay. He calmly assessed the situation, then announced, "Okay, we'll go." Those 3 words shifted the momentum of the war. After years of preparation and weeks of waiting, the invasion was finally in motion. Eisenhower immediately accepted the personal weight of that decision. He returned to his trailer and hand-wrote a secret note to be released if the invasion failed, stating that the blame for the retreat was his fault alone. That evening, he visited the Greenham Common Airfield to meet with the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, just as they prepared to board their transports. He stayed to watch the aircraft take off into the night, saluting the planes with tears in his eyes. He was fully aware that many of the men he had just spoken with would not survive the night. Strategic leadership required more than just picking a date. It meant accepting the absolute moral burden for the lives of every soldier deployed. At dawn, the Allied force hit the beaches under intense German fire. The conditions were chaotic, and the plan immediately began to fracture. They were also hit by a failure in intelligence. The Americans had not trained for the Normandy bocage, a landscape of ancient, impenetrable hedgerows that trapped Allied armor and allowed small German teams to devastate entire battalions. To secure the beachhead, the Allies took 10,000 casualties in the first 24 hours. At Omaha Beach, the assault came so close to a stalemate that commanders briefly considered an evacuation. Despite these losses and intelligence gaps, the foothold was established. The operation succeeded, but it did so by the slimmest of margins. If Eisenhower had chosen to wait for the next moon and tide alignment on June 19th, the outcome of the war would have likely been very different. On June 19th, the worst English Channel storm in a generation struck. The weather was so violent it likely would have sunk the invasion fleet at sea or destroyed the landing craft while they were still in their staging areas. Additionally, the German V-1 rocket campaign against England began on June 12th. These rockets would have targeted the ports where millions of troops were still waiting. If Eisenhower had delayed, the Armada would have been sitting as static, exposed targets for a new kind of aerial bombardment. By choosing to launch during that brief break in the weather on June 6th, Eisenhower avoided a combination of environmental and military threats that could have ended the Allied campaign in Europe before it even reached the shore.